Comparison of educational philosophies, Western versus Indigenous. This paper will compare and contrast educational philosophies of Western and Indigenous people. After reading this paper, a deeper understanding of Indigenous educational philosophy will be learned, and the reasons why Indigenous philosophy isn't taught presently. Early education philosophy. Before colonization, Indigenous education was primarily project-based learning, and Indigenous children were expected to learn all the teachings of the earth. Kinomagawan. Children were completely immersed in a family learning environment to learn a way of life that was well suited to the pressures of their environment. All children were expected to learn because all children were expected to contribute to their society. Children learned botany by understanding the Indigenous taxonomy. The prefixes in the word indicated what the plant looked like, and the suffixes indicated where the plant would be found. For example, words with the ending Jesus was more likely rooted plants versus plants that had the word mina in them, which were plants with berries. Indigenous people had a pharmacy and knew of salicylates, cures for diphtheria, respiratory ailments, and heart arrhythmias. When students made canoes, the canoes had to be made specifically from a certain tree. Interesting to note, the trees Indigenous children had to make canoes from, birch bark, is antimicrobial and stores better than modern plastics. For instance, when creating a canoe, one had to know the temperature of the pitch to use on the canoe, the specific wood to use for the canoe, the mathematics involved when making a canoe, the time of year a successful canoe could be made, the right twine to use to sew the canoe together, and the buoyancy of the canoe for specific purposes, ricing, for example, ricing versus transport of goods. Not to mention the tremendous math and science that is found when making maple syrup, and the practices used to make maple syrup presently were learned from Indigenous people. Education was meant to produce a functioning, self-actualized human capable of surviving and thriving in surrounding environment. Mother Earth is the primary teacher in the classroom for the students. The educational practice is similar to the teachings of John Comaris, who believed that learning must come via the senses through observational experience. He proposed a set of teaching methods that incorporated both the deductive method and whatever instructional method was appropriate for the specific developmental stages of the child, which is similar to Indigenous teaching when we say that people get teachings according to their stage of life. Pinoja, Gigyago, Saksi, Kwa, Damoza. There were many different philosophies that shaped the ancient Western world's educational philosophy. In Sparta, education was used to increase military strength. The welfare of the individual came second to the welfare of the state. In Athens, boys were sent to school from ages 7 to 14, but after 14 years of age, they received demanding physical education. Socrates, during this time, started to change philosophy of learning by stating that the society is only as good as their schools, and that knowledge was ethically and morally important to all men. The Socratic method was developed, and Plato was known to utilize the Socratic method, lecture, and assign individual exercises and problems. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, was a realist and introduced scientific method, which was a stark difference between Aristotle's teacher, Plato. Greeks and Romans' educational philosophies merged into ludus, where reading, writing, and accounting was learned. Out of this era came Quintilian, who was a state-supported teacher. Quintilian recommended a broad educational base, and not homeschooling, but public schooling, so that students could also learn from one another. As civilization changed, Roman Catholicism started to be a motivating force in education during the Middle Ages, and public education disappeared, and the education took place under the Church. Thomas Aquinas was a major philosopher during this time and implored people to look at their spiritual and physical self. After European contact, 95% of indigenous people were wiped out from diseases carried in domesticated cattle from Europe within 2 generations. Biological warfare aided in European colonization, and the European colonial interest in the education of indigenous people of America extends as far back as the Papal Bull, Inter Caetera, of 1493. This document called for training and instruction of indigenous people of the Americas, along with a grant of authority from the Pope to colonize lands for the purpose of propagating the Roman Catholic Church. Long before the United States was formed, Christian missionaries laid the groundwork for non-Indian education of Indian people. Initially, missionaries intended to convert Indian people to Christianity. This was believed to be merciful and divine pursuit of the spiritual practices of indigenous people, because indigenous people were deemed heathen and uncivilized. Painfully, few missionaries recognized the people they encountered as civilized spiritual beings in their own right. Historically, education has been used as a tool of oppression in what may be perceived as an ongoing war against the indigenous people of America. Missionaries were well aware of the impact their interactions had on Indian cultures. The quest to convert and civilize can be seen as a conspiracy by the Church and foreign governments to undermine and overthrow the indigenous systems of government that were in place when they arrived. Under the guise of converting, training, assimilating, and educating for his own good, non-native education policies have sought to morph the Indian into a non-Indian concept of the ideal Western human being. When civilization was forced on indigenous children, the indigenous civilization changed from an educational system built on Kinomagewin to a more Western mentality. What could have been gained if we took education philosophy from indigenous people? In 1517, Martin Luther questioned Catholic authorities and believed that every individual was responsible for his or her salvation that could be obtained by prayer, reading, and studying as an individual. Luther stressed the spiritual, economic, and political benefits of education. He believed that theology should be taught along with math, science, and history. John Calvin believed the necessity of a universal, compulsory, state-supported education that would not only enable all individuals to read the Bible themselves and thereby attain salvation, but also would profit the state through the contributions of an orderly and productive citizenry. John Calvin proposed a two-track educational system consisting of common schools for the masses and then secondary schools to train leaders of the church and state. Vernacular schools provided instruction in the mother tongue, which was usually French, and taught lessons in religion, reading, writing, and mathematics. The time for Reformation allowed people to question religious dogma and investigate the laws of nature. Is it safe to say that at this point the Western world was trying to return to nature and investigate the laws of nature, but they were separating indigenous children from nature? This is a really bizarre fact to me. U.S. American Indian education officially began in 1776, when the Continental Congress made the first federal appropriation for American Indian education. In 1794, the U.S. entered into the first treaty that included educational provisions with an indigenous tribe. By entering into these treaties, the United States became constitutionally obligated to providing a range of educational services for American Indian tribes and tribal citizens. While the U.S. federal government recognizes that it has an obligation to protect Indian people, tribal sovereignty, and treaty rights, it has shirked this duty throughout the history of tribal-federal relations. One of the most devastating instances of the federal government misusing its authority in dealing with Indian tribes and individuals was the Indian Boarding School Initiative. These schools have been criticized by many Native American historians as being the most culturally devastating federal Indian policy ever implemented. These schools were primarily focused on the proletarianization, creating a workforce, and assimilation of Indian people into European American society. Mission boarding schools were around since 1500s. Churches operated the schools and money came from federal accounts. In 1879, the first federal boarding school was opened. Francis Bacon emphasized the need for critical thinking. John Locke taught the tabula rasa, which states that our minds are blank slates when we come into this world and we learn through sensation. John Locke stated that humans have natural rights that come from God, not a governing body. Rousseau is associated with an educational movement called naturalism. Rousseau created a theory of education that influenced many educators. Rousseau is also known to develop learning for the stages of children's thoughts. Pestalozzi recognized the importance of human emotions in the learning process. Herbert created a teaching methodology and said that materials can be learned if they are presented systematically. The English had the greatest influence on education in the United States, but France and Spain also influenced our American education. In conclusion, after learning about the early philosophers that shaped American education, I found that some philosophy was the same within the Western and indigenous civilizations. For instance, when Pestalozzi stated that the child should be taught with love, and indigenous children were taught in a family-friendly environment. Comenius liked students to learn by observation, and indigenous students learned a lot outside of a classroom. Many indigenous scholars say that much of the education learned in Western schools can be learned with an indigenous lens. Education is constantly changing, and hopefully more indigenous philosophy of the North American continent will be intertwined with the Western philosophies, especially when we find that some students need to move when learning a difficult mental task.